Hello, my name is Cooper Norris, and I'd like to talk to you about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the system the United States uses to elect its presidents. Each state is given a number of electors, adding up to 538 nationwide, which states appoint based on the presidential candidate with the most votes in that state. That system is not perfect, however, and I believe it's far inferior to a simple popular vote election. As such, I intend to convince you why I think it should be replaced. The Electoral College should be abolished because it disproportionately favors certain voters over others, opposes many values of democracy, and allows candidates and presidents to ignore certain safe states in favor of a small number of highly contested swing states. First, I believe it disproportionately favors certain voters and states over others. For example, low population states get disproportionately more electoral votes compared to high population states. Wyoming, for example, the least populous state, gets 3 electors to roughly just shy of 600,000 citizens. That's 193,000 people per elector. Whereas California, the largest state, has 727,000 people per elector. As such, Wyoming is right about 3 times as represented as California, by population, of course. There are many historical examples of candidates losing the popular vote and going on to win the election. For example, in 1824, between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, 1876 between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford Hayes, 1888 between Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison, 2000 in George Bush versus Al Gore, and 2016 Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. I'd like to focus in specifically on 2000 Bush versus Gore. According to Thomas Mann from Brookings.edu, Bush won Florida by 537 votes after a heavily contested recount attempt, which ultimately culminated in a Supreme Court case. Now, I want you to think about 537 votes out of, in Florida alone, over 6 million votes cast. That is less than a percentage of a point margin of victory. So what happened in 2000? So Al Gore won about 500,000 more votes nationwide than George Bush. But here was the electoral map. As you can see, I've circled Florida on account of I'm talking about Florida right now. The margin of victory was 271 electoral votes to Bush and 266 to Gore. Now, Florida was obviously, with 25 electoral votes, the deciding state here. It was the last one to be called, and regardless of how the other states in the running went toward the later end of the counting, Florida was absolutely necessary. So, Al Gore originally had called Bush to concede after it looked like Bush had won, but then an hour later retracted his call after it looked more like Al Gore once again was in the lead. So what ultimately ended up happening was a Supreme Court case based on a number of votes in the Miami-Dade County and whether Florida had the authority to issue a law to cast a recount, specifically the Florida Supreme Court. But all this to say, Al Gore won more votes, you know? I hate to oversimplify it like that, but I mean, come on, this is all so ridiculously complicated for something that does not need to be. So, moving on to my second point, it is inherently undemocratic, you know? I think it's bad for democracy when the majority of people can want one thing, and then because of some arbitrary lines and how things are drawn, a different thing happens. A different president is elected than what most people want. And it really promotes a two-party system because you can't afford to lose just one state, just one area. Any spoiler candidate can ruin anything for for the candidate most aligned with them. And it tends to leave folks really underrepresented, which leads into my last point. It makes candidates ignore most states in favor of a very small number of swing states. For example, uh, most campaign stops and funding is done in specific states. In the 2020 presidential election, Pennsylvania and Florida combined had 3/8 of the nation's total campaign stops. Joe Biden's campaign spent $74 million in Florida, and in October, nearly $9 out of every 10 in ad spending from both candidates was spent in just 6 states: Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Arizona. Notice you're not seeing California there, you're not seeing Texas, you're not seeing Illinois. Huge states, but no campaign is ever going to touch them with spending. And that's because there's no reason to. They're not worth any points unless, because the majority of voters in those states have already made up their minds. So why appeal to the rest of them? Why try to boost turnout when you're not, either you've already won the state or you're not going to win the state? So candidates don't need the votes from anyone outside a dozen important states, so they don't worry about their issues, which leads to policies that only help the important voters instead of the majority of Americans. In conclusion, I believe the Electoral College is undemocratic, unhelpful, and unnecessarily complex. It forces candidates to ignore the majority of Americans in favor of a certain subset of voters within arbitrary lines. It should be abolished, and I think everyone should ask their representatives and senators to do something about it. Thank you.